Då drar vi igång. Hej och välkomna allihopa till ZeroMissions After COP26. Här kommer vi att analysera klimatförhandlingarna i Glasgow som avslutades i helgen. Och det här är något som har beskrivits som decenniets viktigaste möte med stora förhoppningar att lösa knutar som har präglat tidigare COPs. Och en sådan viktig knut är det som kallas för Artikel 6 som vi kommer fokusera på idag. Och i förlängningen så kommer det här ha bäring på företags möjlighet att klimatkompensera. Jag ser att ni droppar in fler och fler. En liten introduktion till oss. Om ni kanske har träffat oss, men jag som modererar de här 40 minuterna heter Johanna Grant och jobbar som klimatstrateg på ZeroMission. Och så har vi med oss vår VD Claire Wigg som kommer göra den här analysen. Vi har också med oss Julia som är teknisk support. Så om ni har någonting knas där bakom spakarna så kan ni direkt chatta eller smsa till Julia. Och vi ser att det droppar in fler och fler här. Välkomna alla ni som ansluter nu också. Lite sådana här praktiska detaljer. Vi är ju kanske vana vid Zoom-meetings vid det här laget, men ni får jättegärna ändra namn till förnamn, efternamn och organisation. Vi hoppas vi har en frågestund i slutet där vi alla kan vara med och tänka. Men under presentationen så får ni gärna ha kameraljud avstängt som ni har nu. Och sen kan ni välja, det vet ni också kanske vid det här laget, Gallery View och Speaker View. Så när någon presenterar så är det bra med Speaker View, men sen när vi ses allihopa på frågestund så kan man välja Gallery View. Då får ni gärna slå på kameran också. Ska jag säga också att vi kommer spela in den delen som är presentation, men vi kommer stänga av inspelningen sen när vi har en frågestund på slutet. Och beroende på hur frågvisa ni är, vi har satt tiden till 20:04 att vi avslutar, men vi kan tänka oss att fortsätta fram till 4 om ni vill hänga kvar lite extra med oss. Vi kommer använda chatten för frågor och inga frågor är för dumma. Det här är ett sånt klurigt komplext område så att det är bara att ställa alla frågor som ni kommer på. Sen så kommer vi ha det här seminariet på svengelska. Jag är själv gift med en kanadensare så hemma så pratar jag svenska och kan engelska och så är det på jobbet också. Claire pratar lite engelska, svenska för det mesta för sig, men känner fri att ställa frågor på svenska. Claire kommer göra presentationen på engelska. Lite kort bara om ZeroMission och vårt intresse i det här. Vi har inte ens fått plats med alla nya som är på bilden här. Vi har just blivit ett Gansell-bolag som växer så det knakar. Men vi grundades 2006 och har väldigt starka klimatglasögon på oss och hjälper företag med att mäta, minska och ta hand om sina utsläpp genom klimatkompensation. Och vår vision är att ta företag till netto noll idag för en levande planet imorgon. Men 2006 är ganska lång tid på den här unga marknaden då som är klimatkompensation. Så det som var kutym 2006 det är nästan gammal skåpmat 2021 och vi är mitt inne i ett paradigmskifte där mycket kommer hända på det här området. Lite agenda. Vi kommer ställa oss några frågor. Vad kommer man egentligen fram till i Glasgow med bäring på då den här artikel 6, men också lite background. Vad är artikel 6? Det kommer vara både en grundläggande nivå och fördjupad. Varför det här är relevant för svenska företag som klimatkompenserar och vilka heta frågor kvarstår. Så kommer vi avsluta med den här frågestunden. Och som sagt, artikel 6 har varit en sån här knut som man inte har löst på tidigare COP. Och den här bilden här, den tog jag själv när vi var i Madrid förra klimatförhandlingarna. Då en sån här knapp som folk är runt med. All I want for Christmas is artikel 6. Och det har man faktiskt kommit fram till här nu då i Glasgow. Och jag tänkte jag kan inte låta bli bara göra en liten poll med er. Bara hur insatta ni känner er i frågeområdet här. Så att jag hoppas att ni ser den här pollen som kom upp här nu. Ni får svara på 3 svar egentligen. Hur bekant man känner sig. Är du inte så bekant, ganska insatt eller väl insatt? Så vi vet ungefär vart vi har er. Hoppas jag att den funkar här. Jag ser inte några svar ännu. Men om det någon skulle vara så att ni inte ser den, då får ni helt enkelt sätta på mikrofonen och säga.
Man såg den en stund, men nu är den borta igen.
Jaha, är den borta? Hej Mattias! Kul att höra din röst. Vet ni vad?
Ja.
Ja?
Jag ser det. Jag ser resultaten här faktiskt.
Jaha.
Ja, inte så bekant. 61%. Ganska insatt 35%. Väl insatt 8%.
Okej. Ja, men då har vi hela registret med majoriteten inte så bekant. Så att med det, jag slutar den där pollen och så, just det här kan man share results. Vi stänger av den där. Jag tar lite sån här bakgrund så att vi, innan jag släpper in dig Claire, så att ni har lite koll på lingot. Och jag ska också säga att i chatten så har vi delat en liten ordlista, för det är så mycket förkortningar och begrepp och sådana saker som ni alltid, om ni får upp den ligger på Google Drive en länk, då kan man gå tillbaka och titta lite på den. Men lite bakgrund bara när det kommer till klimatkompensationsmarknaden. Innan Parisavtalet så har vi haft Kyotoprotokollet, och de skiljer sig ganska mycket på det sättet att i Kyotoprotokollet så delade man upp länder i princip de rika och de fattiga, där de rika länderna hade åtaganden att göra klimatsatsningar i utvecklingsländer och hjälpa dem. Och för att kunna göra det så finns den här mekanismen Clean Development Mechanism. Så i princip så kunde rika länder finansiera till exempel vindkraft i fattigare länder och på så sätt tillgodoräkna sig klimatnyttan genom i princip klimatkompensation som heter CDM. I Parisavtalet så delar man inte upp de fattiga och rika länderna i två lag, utan alla spelar på samma planhalva med det gemensamma målet att försöka nå 1,5-gradersmålet, där varje land har sina egna, de här NDC-erna, klimatplanerna, där de sätter upp mål för hur de ska gå tillväga och nå målet. Så att CDM kommer ändras från grunden, och när man övergick från Kyoto till Parisavtalet så behövs en ny regelbok för att möjliggöra den här marknadsmekanismen för internationell utsläppshandel. Och den regelboken är då artikel 6. Inom Kyoto, om vi går tillbaka till klimatkompensationsmarknaden så som vi känner den, så kan man se sig framför två marknadsplatser. Två fruktstånd kan man tänka sig. I den ena marknadsplatsen där är det länder som handlar, och det är den reglerade marknaden då, den här CDM-marknaden. Och sen så finns det även en frivillig marknad som har funnits både innan och efter Kyoto-protokollet, där andra standarder har verifierat utsläppsminskningar. Så på den reglerade marknaden, där har krediterna som säljs kallats för CER, Certified Emission Reduction, och på den frivilliga marknaden så heter de Verified Emission Reductions, VER. Men sen så har de här frukterna blandats lite, så även på den frivilliga marknaden som har kunnat handla sådana här CDM-krediter, CER. Och det finns lite olika standarder som ni ser, Gold-standard och Plan Vivo, och även Fairtrade har kommit in som certifierar sådana här utsläppsminskningar eller krediter på den frivilliga marknaden. Så det är lite background. Som sagt, den här ordlistan, ni ser, vi kommer prata om corresponding adjustments och double counting och ITMOs och massa saker. ITMO är någonting som jag hoppas ni kommer med härifrån och kommer ihåg vad det är. Det kommer vara en viktig del. Men den här ordlistan finns som sagt som en pdf i chatten. Då Claire, nu släpper jag in dig för analysen. Här satt du i Madrid och spanade vid en brasa, bonfire discussion, för 2 år sedan. Så jag lämnar över till dig. Ska jag sluta dela och låta dig ta upp. Som sagt, har ni frågor så kan ni alltid ställa dem i chatten under tiden också. Annars har vi också frågestund sen efter det här.
Bra, ser allting bra ut här och ni hör mig?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, Johanna. I have the pleasure today of talking about the outcomes from COP that relate to Article 6. And the reason for us hosting this seminar is that we sell carbon credits at Zero Mission to Swedish companies, and Article 6 is already having an impact on the voluntary carbon market. And at COP26, some important agreements were made, which is good. I wasn't there myself, but the coverage, as you all know, has been amazing. So I've read as much as I can online, in the media, and from other people's webinars. And of course, we've been following the debate for many years about Article 6. But I'm also aware that there are many experts in the audience today. So please, at the end, please don't hesitate to make your comments and correct me if necessary. So, here we go. See if I can get forward in this presentation. So there were, by way of introduction, sort of basically, I think, three things that came out of COP26, more generally, outcomes in three areas, you could say. There were many pledges made by countries unilaterally or together in groups. And the mere fact that all the countries got together, and they get together every year for this, prompts them to come up with new ideas and new plans, which they then announce under these 2 weeks. So there's one about stopping finance to fossil fuel projects abroad, for example, made by 20 countries in week 1. And then if we go to the middle here, we have something that what was written and agreed at COP26. It's called the Glasgow Climate Pact, and it consists of 97 points. And it's a statement of what everybody at the conference agreed. It's not really rules, it's more like a statement of what people think is important. And the clauses, these 97 clauses, begin with words like emphasize or recognize or we urge or acknowledge. And just to give an example, the first one is, the conference recognizes the importance of the best available science for effective climate action and policy making. Sounds good. And then we come to the third part, though, the part we're talking about today, the rule book for implementing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to go through what Article 6 actually is. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is a single side of A4 text with 9 paragraphs. And it establishes 3 separate mechanisms for voluntary cooperation between countries towards climate goals. 2 of them are market-based, that means money is involved and things are traded. And the third is so-called non-market approaches. And in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, these concepts and frameworks were established in this one side of text. But now from COP26, we have a rule book, which is all the details of how this will actually be implemented. So the aim of Article 6, broadly, is to guide countries to cooperate, to generate more greenhouse gas reductions than they would have achieved on their own, which also sounds good. So here is a brief summary of the 9 paragraphs of Article 6. 6.1 sets the aim, the voluntary cooperation to achieve greater emission reductions than we would do otherwise. 6.2, that establishes these ITMOs, which Johanna mentioned, and that they can be transferred between countries. And it also has 4 key concepts that are thought to be important: sustainable development, environmental integrity, transparency, and no double counting. And then there's 6.3, which just states that everything in Article 6 is voluntary and must be authorized. Countries must allow things to happen. And then 6.4, that establishes this organization to oversee the replacement to the CDM, which we'll come to. It doesn't have a name yet, but whatever it's going to be. 6.5 states again the principle of no double counting of these ITMOs. And 6.6 is about so-called share of proceeds to support vulnerable developing countries. And that one is actually outstanding from COP26. That hasn't really been agreed. 6.7 says that the COP will establish the rules and procedures for Article 6 implementation, which is precisely what they've just done. And 6.8 gives some more principles. So as well as those 4 principles we had in 6.2, we also have raising ambition, private sector participation, which is very relevant here today, and coordination of systems. And then we have 6.9, the last, which is that just says that this is a framework for non-market approaches to sustainable development shall be defined, or is defined. And it's just the one which allows these things which aren't about trading to occur. So next I'm going to go through some of them. In this slide here, you'll see that the ones that are even numbered, 6.2, 4, 6 and 8, are in one colour. And that's because they're the ones you hear most about. So they're perhaps the ones we're going to focus more on today. So first we come to paragraph 6.2. And this is where these ITMOs come into being, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And ITMOs are emissions reductions that have been achieved that pass from one country to another. So they go from one country's greenhouse gas inventory to another country's. And an ITMO essentially is a carbon credit, but it's a carbon credit at country level, and it's generated in one country, the country on the right in this picture. So it's an emissions reductions project which occurs in the so-called host country and generates this thing called an ITMO, which presumably, but hasn't been defined as far as I know, presumably will represent 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. And then this ITMO is being financed by the country on the left, country 1, and the ITMO itself is then transferred from one country to another in exchange for money. So essentially carbon credits. And like other carbon credits, the ITMOs are generated in projects that either reduce emissions or remove greenhouse gases in the territory of the host, so-called host country. So that's ITMOs. And then we come to 6.4, if we skip from 6.2 to 6.4, and this is the one that establishes a centralized hub to replace the CDM. So as Johanna mentioned at the beginning, under the Kyoto Protocol, we had this organization called the Clean Development Mechanism under the UN. And under the Paris Agreement, ITMOs will be managed by something. It's not, as far as I know, it's not established yet or even got a name, but maybe it'll be the Sustainable Development Mechanism. And that organisation will be a hub to oversee and facilitate the creation and transfer and supervision of these ITMOs. Moving on, we're actually going to touch on an odd-numbered paragraph here, number 6.5, because that is the one that states very clearly there shall be no double counting. And that means no double counting of emissions reductions by 2 parties. So it's about, and this is one of the big issues that's been a sticking point at COP meetings over the last 5 years. And now it's been solved, well, what's solved largely. So it says that, as I say, that these ITMOs may not be counted twice in 2 of the countries' accounting. And the process, the name of the process that is going to be put in place to avoid this is another important term, a corresponding adjustment. Each of these 2 countries, country 1 and country 2, have to do national carbon accounting, which is very much like doing an organizational carbon footprint for a company. And the system of corresponding adjustments means that an adjustment is made in these countries' carbon accounts when an ITMO passes from one to the other. So the host country, in this case, country 2, must first authorize the transfer of the ITMOs it has achieved to country 1, to somebody else. And then country 2 will adjust its own greenhouse gas counts to reflect the fact that the emission reduction achieved within its borders has actually going to be claimed and credited to another country, to country 1. And as I understand it, the theory is that country 1, of course, then also adjusts its greenhouse gas accounts by the same amount. So the country 1 gets the benefit in its accounts of the emission reduction that it's funded in country 2 through the mechanism of corresponding adjustments. Now, this was a very big sticking point. Lots of these things were sticking points in up until the Glasgow meeting. And I apologise, this is all a bit technical, but I'll just go quickly through the achievements that were made in getting agreement on this. So one of the issues was, do these corresponding adjustments have to happen in every single instance? And you can imagine that maybe one of the countries has its focus for its reductions is only in the field of renewable energy. So we say that Brazil, for instance, this would not be potentially its plan. But anyway, say Brazil is only focusing in its agreed plan, its nationally determined contribution, on switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But another country, say Sweden, finances a forestry project there. So the forestry project is not in or within Brazil's own plan at the moment, because Brazil is only focusing in our scenario on renewable energy. But say that Sweden focuses a forestry project there. The question was, would Brazil have to make a corresponding adjustment if it sells an ITMO to Sweden? And in Glasgow, it was agreed that that would be done. So corresponding adjustments are required broadly across the board, regardless of what activity is being done in the host country. The second big issue was, should corresponding adjustments be required when these ITMOs are used not by countries themselves, but in other schemes? And you might have heard of the global aviation scheme, CORSIA, which is an offsetting scheme for all airlines, hopefully. And the question was, would a country like Kenya need to make an adjustment in its carbon accounting if it sells ITMOs that are bought by members of the CORSIA scheme? And again, it was agreed that they would be needed. So that's also positive, we would say, for environmental integrity. But then there was a compromise. So to get these two agreements, numbers 1 and 2, there had to be a compromise for the parties that were objecting. And the compromise was that the countries can continue to use for now the remaining CDM credits. So there are 100 million CDM leftover, as it were, CDM credits from the Kyoto Protocol around for use, and it was agreed that they could be used to help countries fulfill their nationally determined contributions in the short term. There are limits on it, but that was agreed. So that was a compromise to get points 1 and 2 through. So moving on from that very technical stuff, we give an example here of a corresponding adjustment scenario. And this is the one that I was saying about the forests and the fossil fuels. So here we have the country on the left that is working today only on its renewable energy, and the country on the right, which is prepared to fund something in the forestry sector. And it was agreed that this would need to have corresponding adjustments applied. And here is the compromise, that the CDM credits from projects, only the ones registered after January 2013, may be used for the short term to help countries to achieve their nationally determined contributions. So now we come back to the reason why we're here today. Why is all this relevant for Swedish companies? And the thing is that Article 6 is about companies as well as countries. In the Paris Agreement, non-state actors and the private sector have a role. They're in the agreement, they're written in. And this is new. Companies weren't active participants, as far as I know, in the Kyoto Protocol. So the Paris Agreement opens the way for companies to get involved in these market mechanisms if that's what we collectively decide is the right thing to do. So this means that the boundaries between these two markets, the market of ITMOs between countries and the market for these voluntary VERs, as they're called today, for non-state actors, become blurred, which has been happening already, but it's going to perhaps be more so in the future. So the voluntary carbon market has been pondering all this since the Paris Agreement was put in place. And the question, the hot debate is, should corresponding adjustments be required when companies, not countries, companies buy carbon credits, which of course originate in countries abroad, mostly developing countries? So from my perspective, I think there are 3 big questions here to be answered before this question is resolved. This question is not resolved yet. So the first one is, are corresponding adjustments really needed in the voluntary carbon market? So the question there is, would it really be double counting if corresponding adjustments were not made by countries when companies buy carbon credits voluntarily? And the argument here is that the carbon accounting done by companies is not connected in any way, shape or form to the emissions accounting done by countries. They're 2 completely different systems. So you could argue that, or people do argue, that it wouldn't be double accounting if there were no corresponding adjustments made when companies buy credits from other countries. And the argument also continues that corresponding adjustments, it's not that is important to ensure the environmental integrity of the carbon credits that companies buy voluntarily. What's really important is the additionality of those carbon credits. That means that the projects and the activities that lead to those emission reductions really, really, truly wouldn't have happened without the finance from the carbon credit purchases. So that's one key question, which is not resolved. Are corresponding adjustments really needed in the voluntary market? And then there's a question about the complexity of the systems that be required. There are currently over 5,000 validated projects under the best known carbon offset standards, some of which are very small. And there is a big question over whether developing countries have the capacity or the resources required to track all these projects. And is it fair to expect them to put these potentially expensive systems in place just to facilitate this, or make some parties feel more comfortable with this mechanism? So there's a question there about capacity and resources and the development of systems. And then the third question is this really in the best interests of the developing countries and of the project participants who take part and do the activities that lead to these reductions? It's the developing countries where the projects take place today, and therefore they would have the burden of implementing corresponding adjustments if they're required in the voluntary market. And given that developing countries now have emissions reductions goals of their own, and they need to finance these reductions, and they also have lots and lots of other things to do suddenly under the Paris Agreement, getting in place all their measuring and everything, are they going to want to make corresponding adjustments? Is it in their interests even? And is it in the interests of the people and the projects that we support to make that mechanism a requirement? Those are three outstanding questions, all around the question of are corresponding adjustments needed in the voluntary market? And as I said, this is not resolved. And at the moment, there are two big debates. The market is actually, there are two different sides to this. The market is actually split on this question. So you may have heard of the gold standard carbon credit program and of Vera, who administer the VCS program. And one is in the US and one is in the EU, and they are taking different views on this matter. So the Vera in the US, they say you don't need corresponding adjustments in this market. And gold standard in the EU say that all certified projects should have corresponding adjustments to, currently at least, completely irreconcilable positions. And gold standard has gone further in that they're trying to make this, ease the way for this to be implemented. So they're helping some country governments to understand the potential implications of this. For instance, they've been working with Mongolian government to advise them. And they're also setting up a so-called early mover program to help countries be ready for this to be introduced. And they propose a transition period for the introduction of corresponding adjustments, with the most developed countries having to go first. And the least developed countries like Madagascar and Timor-Leste, which are so-called least developed countries, they would be given more time to get ready for this. So in Zero Mission, we work mostly with the standard Plan Vivo, and they haven't come down on either side of this debate yet. Their focus is very much on the needs of the people who participate in the Plan Vivo projects, and it's far from clear yet whether corresponding adjustments will actually be in the interests of those people, the people on the ground who participate in the carbon offset projects. So because a risk with requiring corresponding adjustments is that projects stop receiving money, if the money that they need to operate, if buyers stop buying, because they choose to be on one side or other of this debate, or if the countries don't have the resources and systems to track the projects in order to make the corresponding adjustments. And with poor governance in many developing countries, it could make it very difficult for projects, especially small projects led by NGOs, to get registered in the necessary systems. Maybe government officials will want payments for receiving applications or providing letters, or they'll introduce unreasonable requirements for projects when they ask for the recognition they need to get into the corresponding adjustment system. So there are risks for projects in this situation. And don't forget that for many developing countries, the Paris Agreement introduced completely new expectations, all this about measuring their emissions, which we know isn't easy, and robust systems for accounting and proving that they're following their national determined contributions. So this is a big rift at the moment in the voluntary carbon market, and lots of us are thinking about it, and there's no clear path through this yet. So what does this, oh, I beg your pardon, I have slide 2. What does this all mean for voluntary carbon offset buyers in Sweden? And I have 6 points here. This is the 6 points I finish with, and then we take a discussion. So who will require corresponding adjustments in the voluntary market? As far as I can see, this is not going to be determined by a COP. This is not a country level question. So if there continues to be a split in the voluntary carbon market, there will be carbon credits available both with and without corresponding adjustments. So buyers at some point will have to decide what they think. There's likely to be a transition period before all this is settled, so we have some time to consider the question, to see how the market evolves, to take us advice from experts. And there are a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives who are going to give a steer on this, I'm sure. There is one in the Nordics, and there's the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative in Europe, and the so-called task force on scaling the market. So all these will provide a steer on this question. Then there will be different situations in different countries. So in some countries in the short term, they'll move quickly towards providing corresponding adjustments in the voluntary market. I've heard that Rwanda, for instance, is far ahead. But others will move slowly, and we'll have to see whether demand follows the ones that are early movers, or the ones that, or it'll be okay to still buy from the countries which don't put in corresponding adjustments so soon. So speed of transition is a question. If the argument in favour of corresponding adjustments wins out, then they will eventually become the norm. But the question is when. It looks as if it'll take a number of years, maybe 3 or 5 years. So maybe the change will be in place around 2025, if that's the way it goes. With the shift to corresponding adjustments, if that's what happens, prices will go up for carbon credits bought by companies. It seems only fair that buyers in wealthier countries should pay something to a government that has to adjust upwards its emissions goals when someone somewhere else wants to claim that emission reduction as their own. And prices are going up now for other reasons as well. There's increased demand, uncertainties in the market, and it takes time to develop new projects. So there's going to be potentially a lack of credits to buy them for a while. So carbon corresponding adjustments will be just another reason for prices to go up, and they may go up quite a lot, depending how these mechanisms are introduced. Then there will be closer connections between projects in the voluntary market, the type that a typical gold standard or Plan Viva project will have to have if corresponding adjustments are introduced, closer connections to governments. And this we'll have to see. It's hard to see what all the potential impacts of this. Some may be net positive and some may be negative, but there will have to be closer connections for those small scale voluntary carbon projects with the governments in the countries in which they're operating. And lastly, we come to the question of claims. A company in future that's wanting to claim that it's offsetting, or claim that it's carbon neutral or reach net zero, this will be affected by this question. And given this uncertainty, there will be a new way to use carbon credits, which is essentially not to use them at all. So rather than claiming to have offset emissions, companies will be contributing financially to other countries' efforts to introduce and achieve their nationally determined contributions if corresponding adjustments aren't made. So there'll be a new claim, a new way to contribute to emissions reductions overall. And we're quite used to countries providing financial aid to other countries, but this non-offsetting way of contributing will be new for companies. So if carbon credits in, say, Kenya are funded by a company in Sweden, then if corresponding adjustments aren't made, then one option might be that the company will be contributing to Kenya's own efforts to reduce its net emissions, but the company in Sweden won't be making a claim of offsetting. It will be making a claim of literally contributing financially. So that's a bit of the new landscape that will be out there, and depending how and when this issue is resolved. That is the end of my presentation. I hope I've been able to explain clearly some of these complex issues, and I look forward to questions and a discussion.